Hello, everyone. This is a writers panel just to get several perspectives. The writers here are all members of Charm City Filmmakers. They've all, at one point or another, turned that script into a film, at least on one occasion, if not more. And they also all have extensive writing background. I guess what I would like to start with is just a quick introduction, specifically name, and then your writing and directing experience. Fair enough? Um, Diney, start us off, if you would, please.
Hello, my name is Aphrodite Lee. I've been writing screenplays since I was 19. I have about 6 short films done, two with Charm City. Thank God for Charm City. I'm also a novelist, and that's all I can think about. And I write a lot of songs. I think I have more songs than anything. I write a lot.
Self-published. You're doing pretty well with that too. All right. Matt, could you unmute and introduce and say hi, please?
Hey, how's it going, guys? I'm Matt Furman. I I guess I've been writing and making films with my brother John as far back as like 2012. I would say, yeah, we did 3 films altogether. One of them was outside of Charm City. The second film that we did, which was definitely a much more formidable one, 1042, we did with the help of Charm City. So really thankful for them and all the resources they've been providing since then and how awesome they've been expanding. And then after that, we did another film called Vaporwave, which recently got into the Maryland Film Fest right in time for COVID. So had to do it the virtual way, but hey, it still counts. And now we're actually pivoting into something else. We're trying to start a company to help screenplay writers and filmmakers by creating free writing tools that incorporates deep learning intelligence. So if anybody wants to hear more about that after this panel, yeah, I'd be very happy to talk about it.
It certainly would touch back to the idea of the structure of writing. So yeah, I would definitely like to talk about that later. All right. Justin, please introduce yourself to the group, writing background.
Hey, my name's Justin. I started writing in theater. I majored in theater, graduated in 2010 from University of Maryland. And that I've had several short plays produced. I've also worked on what's called devised work, where you kind of write the play with the actors as you're creating it over the course of a couple months. Had one of those produced. I've written 3 of my own short films, which I all produced with Charm City. And then I am currently in a writer's group on something that's being attempted to turn into a TV short, like a, what do you call it, miniseries? That's the term. I know what these industry terms are.
Excellent. All right. Finally, Ken, introduction, writing background. Still muted or very quiet.
Yeah, that's better. You probably want to hear what I'm saying. All right, Ken Alston, been writing forever, it seems. I feel like I've recently started the beginning of my breakthrough. Written several scripts, did a couple of shorts with Charm City, got a couple of options right before COVID hit. Low money options, enough to pay for all the contests and hosting fees that for my other scripts, but options nonetheless. But COVID hit, so things are starting to ramp up again. Got a script in pre-production, just attached to director. We're going out to actors, so hopefully, fingers crossed, if that goes well over the next few weeks. And again, if people start going back to sets for the kind of film that I wrote anyway, should be making that transition relatively soon to a no pay writer to a little pay writer. That's pretty much it.
Excellent.
Yeah, we're on now. See, we're up there.
All right. Hold on, we got some new people that need to turn off their videos. Give me a second. All right, excellent. So let's start. My first question, actually, well, let's start with the first question. So I know that for a lot of people, especially when they're first, if they haven't written anything before, they're really searching for inspiration. Where do they get their ideas? So where does the story start for you? And so where do you pull inspiration from for that in the very beginning of those ideas? Open question. Maybe someone who isn't muted. I guess that's just Justin.
Yeah.
So where do you get your ideas? Justin.
Man, they've always just kind of come to me. I'm just trying to think of a way for that not to sound.
Well, is it like, does it come to you when you're driving, when you're in the shower? Is it like you're?
No, it depends on the film. I remember the very first thing I ever wrote was based on like one line from a play, which was like cancer. It's for August Osage County, which they ended up making a movie with like Meryl Streep and stuff. And it was just cancer's fucking cancer. Like everyone gets cancer, you know. And I remember just being so glib. I wrote a play about this pregnant woman and her husband had cancer, or she finds out she's pregnant and her husband has cancer, and she's not sure she wants to keep it because it's like he thinks it's terminal, but he has like a really dark sense of humor about it, and he keeps joking about the fact he has cancer. You know, that's just how he copes with everything. And that was from that play. That happened to my mom. Was where that came from. My mom, when she was pregnant with my brother, my dad had leukemia. So that was like the onus of that one. Sometimes, you know, I'll write amalgamations of stories and based on people I know or certain inspirations. Like I was reading this book on genetics by a cancer researcher named Siddhartha Mukherjee, who's really interesting guy. But his family has like a pretty severe history of mental illness. Like 3 of his uncles had severe bipolar schizophrenia, and like his dad didn't have any discernible mental illness, but a lot of his family has been institutionalized. And his family, so they're Bengali and they're from the east of India. And so he's a little older. He's probably like approaching 50 now. They all survived like the Bengali genocidal efforts from the 70s. So they didn't understand that schizophrenia could be genetic. Like they just did not accept that as like, you know, kind of poor rural Indian people at like the fall of colonialism. I thought that was really interesting. I was thinking about maybe writing something like that about, you know, like this one genius guy who has to tell his family about like their own genetics. Wow. I thought that was really great. And he's like 25% them, right? So he's like, he has a PhD from Oxford and an MD from Harvard. He's like one of the most educated people on the planet right now. But he's 25% the same genetically as these people who end up in like mental health institutions. Like it's really coin flips when you think about that. So for him, like he has a profound understanding of this and what it means. And like his kids find out about their mental health history through this book. It was pretty crazy. So I thought that like his, also one of the things happened to his dad later in life is he ended up coming up with this medical condition, and I highlighted it. He ended up like falling out of his chair and like urinating on himself and when he was sleeping, and like to see your father that way, it was almost like he compared it to like the biblical story of Ham when he found Noah like drunk in the woods with his genitals exposed. It's like from the Bible. And he's like, in modern times you find, his exact words were, in modern times the equivalent of that is finding your dad with like urine stained underwear, like staggering around in the middle of the night, illuminating your future in front of you. And I was like, don't say that, Sid. Like, I can't deal with that idea. That's too powerful. But I thought he was really interesting because that's also, I guess when you're going to the ideas, that character, someone with that level of education, dealing with a familial story like that, like he just knows everything, right? I mean, the guy's one of our world's greatest doctors. So I'm just like, man, can you think of all the things the character could do as kind of a structural narrative device? just telling people about their own genetics. Like he knows everything, you know, just everything. There's nothing that character wouldn't know. Like he would just be dealing, or he or she would be dealing, or they would be dealing with nothing but kind of the ignorance and of other people. And I imagine it'd be very hard for them to be empathetic, you know, to the, not to the character, to themselves, but to like the people in their lives, or for the audience to have empathy for them. I'm sure you could find it, but I don't know. That was an idea that probably was my most recent, and it was from that book. So,
Well, okay. So what I'm hearing is that you come across something interesting, and then you connect it to another interesting kind of character, and then the interesting character lets you explore basic human themes.
yeah, it's like, I think the biggest thing I look for in any kind of inspiration, I'm trying to think of other examples, because it's sometimes like things will just like hit you, or like there'll be one, sometimes it's just like the idea of an image, and like I'll work backwards from like one moment of a story I know I want an image, and I'm like, okay, well, what character gets to that point? I'm trying to think of an example of like, there'll be a very specific moment. I wrote, here's a good one. I had this idea of, I was like, I don't know. I think I might be a bad sample, because I don't want to be like, look, I'm just a creative genius. Like, have you ever just tried being talented? No, but you know, like I was doing a play in what is now Motor House, but before it was Motor House, it was this thing called Load of Fun, which was like an absolute fucking death trap. Like, if that place ever caught fire, everyone would die. Like, I'm not exaggerating. Nothing was up to code. Like, there's a reason why a fire marshal can shut a building down, and everything was in there. But you would hear like the craziest shit, because it was, you know, it's right on North and Howard. Sometimes like it's a rough neighborhood. Sometimes you'll just be doing like you'll be in a rehearsal, and like you'll hear crazy shit. And I was like, man, like what if you wrote a play that had like this meta text, that during the play, when you're producing it in a bad neighborhood, you heard some shit that you would hear in a bad neighborhood, and like everyone just had to acknowledge like this kind of like guerrilla theater element. And I was like, well, that's kind of crazy, because if you're in the middle of Baltimore and you're like, hey, what if every night at like 8:30 someone screamed as if they were being murdered in the middle of Baltimore? I'm like, that might not be worth it for theater, right? Like, that's just maybe too real. So I ended up, was like, well, what if someone had like a laugh track, and the laugh track broke? Like, it was like supposed to be like a sitcom, and the laugh track broke in the play. Like, the play is like set up like a sitcom, it has the laugh track, and then the laugh track broke. And I was like, man, what if it was something like really fucked up? Like, what if it was someone who had probably some sort of mental health issue, or like seemed like a character with maybe autism? Because a lot of those characters back then probably could be like, you know, caricatures of what we would now consider mental illness. And then I was like, well, what if it was something more fucked up? What if it was something like super racist? What if it was, and then it ended up being, what if it was a black guy that they made put on white face and act like an absolute fucking idiot? Like, it's almost like worse than blackface. And I just wrote the entire play to break the laugh track, just to have that moment of like a laugh track breaking. And it ended up just being a whole play. But then I had to work backwards from that. I'm like, okay, like what's the episode of this series? Like, what's the world? Who are these characters? And I had to build the skeleton around like this one idea of having someone turn off the line is turn off the fucking laugh track. Like, I was writing an entire play before and after that moment.
All right. So it starts with the moment. Excellent.
Yeah, that one was start of the moment. Yeah.
What about anyone else?
That's always one of the hardest questions to answer, because by the time you're sitting to write your story, so many other things jumped in and influenced it. So I'm trying to, like, if I really go back to, I'm trying to think of some of my more recent stuff, it's always been some kind of a character that just came to mind, that I want to put in some kind of trouble and figure their way back. And who was this? It's just not easy to say.
I got a quick question.
I get inspired.
I got a quick poll question, because I'm hearing this a couple of times. How many times, if all five of you, how many times do you find yourself in a situation where you start at a moment and write backwards, or you start at the beginning and write forwards? Is it more backwards or forwards?
More backwards than forwards for me, but that's usually because by the time I decided who this character is, I'll give you an example. One of the A lot of my story ideas for the characters themselves come from what ifs, and I was about 16 or 17. I was watching an episode of Oprah of all things, and they had a woman. They had several women on there talking about amnesia, and they were all just describing, oh, this happened to me, how it happened, blah blah blah. Nothing that you haven't already heard. But one woman said that the hardest thing, her transition wasn't too hard because she never got her memory back, but she was living the life that she would have been living. So not remembering it didn't bother her. Like the guy that she was married to, who she didn't know anymore, was somebody she was her type. So it didn't seem strange to her. The job that she was working, she was a nurse, and she always wanted to be a nurse, kind of thing, you know. So I said, well, what if that's not what happened to you? What if you woke up and everybody and everything in your world was strange, and then it just went from there? So a lot of my stories go from me asking what if and just trying to fuck everything up. I like to do
Well,
that.
for me personally, I used to start with what I would do, because again, I'm focused more on film, movies. That's what my 99% of my writing is about. So I focus on trailable moments. So in my head, I'm picturing the things that are going to be, what if I'm sitting in a dark movie theater? What are the things that are going to, what are those moments that can go up on that screen and make me go, I want to know more about the story. I want to know more about this character. So I typically start with that. And I used to start with the beginning. And I find that when you start with the beginning, I think most of us can pretty much write an engrossing beginning of a story, because that's where you have all your questions, your intrigue. It's easy to do the setup. Then once you get into the second act for a script, it kind of peters out. And then by the time you get to the end, if you make it, you go, I probably wasted my time. So I'll look at those trailable moments. I'll say, what's that beginning that can spark that interest? But before I put uh, pen to paper, I'll I'll try to figure out what is that ending that's going to satisfy those trailable moments and those questions that I asked in the beginning. If I can come up with something that feels right, then I write it. But truth be told, typically, even if I do an outline, the endings always change anyway. But honestly, if you don't have that end in mind, if you can't work backwards from that ending, you're probably not going to finish anyway, at least for me. So you kind of have to have some indication of where your characters are going to be for a film. I mean, if you're writing some other a novel or play where you have more freedom to explore characters, where in film people are, at least with American cinema, you're more plot centric. So people want to know at the end, oh, Bruce Willis was actually dead. So you might not know that ending at the beginning, but you've got to set up your story with an ending in mind, and then as you navigate through it, that ending might change to something more satisfying. But it's like, so to answer your question, when I first started writing, I would always start with the beginning and work my way through the end, and found that it was easy to hold people's interest for 10 pages. And then after those 10 pages, the interest kind of tapered off. Whereas as I started to say, well, I know I got to know what those 10 pages are. I know I got to have a big juicy moment and a twist in the middle. But if I also have that last moment, if I know where I'm going, those are the scripts that I tend to finish.
It's interesting. It sounds like for some people, it's about asking a question, what if, and then writing something to answer it. Whereas for Ken, it sounds to me like more like you're trying to write questions that the audience will ask and then come up with an interesting answer.
Yeah. Also, not to jump in, I don't know if I'm
Please.
muted, but I think every writer, and I think probably the whole panel will agree with this, is your writing process changes as you go on.
Okay.
Like at the first, I was just like, all right, I'll just jump in, and it's what they call quote unquote dirty headlights, where you just do like a vomit draft, and then as you've hit enough bad endings, and then you gotta like you really can't fix your third act unless you fix your second act. So a lot of times you try to get your third act right, just so you don't waste so much time having to write like 3 different second acts, so you can get a good third act. I don't know if you guys.
I don't usually fall too far into that anymore since I like in my from my 20s on as a kid I screwed up a lot. But I don't even start writing until I map it all out. I'm
Yeah,
that one. I'm that person.
yeah.
So I have a beginning and a middle of end before I write, interior, blah blah
That is,
blah.
that is completely different from how I write.
Yeah.
It's
All right, so
a lot of
Levi,
my
where do your
passion.
ideas come from? Where do you
You,
start? Beginning, the end?
just
Oh, I'm sorry, real quick. Levi, if you could introduce yourself to the group real quick, just real quick.
Hi.
Your name and your writing experience.
Hi, I'm late because I was watching Mask of Zorro and I thought this was at 6 and not at 5. So go rewatch Mask of Zorro. It's awesome. But so I'm Levi. I write. I guess I write. So they put me on this panel. Yeah, I mostly do a lot of genre writing, that sort of thing. I pretty much only write films. I learned early on I am a god awful novelist. Mostly because I run out of words. There's only so many times I can use certain words, and it gets to the point where I'm like, I am very, very tired of describing this room. Because I would love to describe this room more. I would love to describe what's happening in this character's head, but there's only so many times I can use my vocabulary words without it being annoying. So I found that film worked a lot better. I guess for me, a lot of my ideas come, I guess, from three different areas. It's history is one of them, because history is weird. There's a lot of stuff.
Fair.
There's so much stuff that it's just like you read that and you read certain things and you're like, did I read that right? It's like, for
But
example,
you're not looking to recreate it. So
no,
you read this weird story where this person did this weird thing, and then that's the kernel of a completely different.
exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
Well,
Gotcha.
it's like you read certain stories where you're like, what? Like, how did that happen? Or why did that person make that decision? It's for instance, something there's a reason why, like, your mom probably told you not to sit so close to the television. Like, it'll wreck your eyes, it'll hurt you. That's because GE recalled about 10,000 color televisions in the 1950s because they were giving off low levels of radiation. They were
That's what I
like
do anymore.
firing radiation from the television because
I could have got superpowers, man.
because something was screwing and it was projecting that out. And they're like, look, unless you were sitting super close to the TV, you would be fine. And odds are the only people sitting super close to the TV is kids, because their parents are probably taking up the sofa. So I read something like that and I'm like, that's pretty wild. So then my mind starts racing. I'm like, okay, what happens to the 10,000 or so kids that sat too close to their TVs in the 1950s? What happened to those kids? Like, okay. And then I can start building it out from there. Or you have these stories of like 3 people all declare themselves the Pope at the same time after the Pope dies, and all of them excommunicate each other. So none of them can be the Pope. So it's like you have these stories like that where these crazy things happen, and you could say, okay, I don't want to adapt that exactly, but having a situation where there's a power vacuum, 3 people come in, and all 3 of them are trying to figure out how to split things up in a non-violent way can be funny, or it can be interesting, it can be dark. It's however you would like. So looking to history is one way I do it. Another one is just living in Baltimore. You see enough interesting people and interesting things, and there are different places where you see some interesting looking people, and I just think to myself, it's like, what's that guy's story? What's he doing here?
So you like to answer questions?
Yeah, it's like what
Me too.
like what's up with him? It also comes from my work, because you encounter enough like weird problems and situations that you kind of start going off on it. And the other thing is I'm always learning. I'm always reading something, I'm always taking in a new story, and then I usually ask, what if the opposite happened? Has anyone done something in this particular style? Has anyone taken this story in this direction? One of my favorite pastimes is saying, you know what would be funny? Is it watching like an extremely dramatic or really tough situation and being like, you know what would be really funny, or what it would be kind of weird if this happened? It's like, guy jumps off a cliff, but he doesn't die when he hits the bottom. You know, you would expect him just to go splat, but he doesn't die. Okay, let's go from there. It's really, and sometimes it is writing a scene in the middle. It's coming up with like one sight gag or the big dramatic reveal of a villain or something and being like, that's really cool. So how do I get to that point? And then sometimes you end up writing backwards.
So you're still starting with something interesting and then using that to ask a question and then see where that, and then writing answers.
Yeah.
The biggest difference between what you do and what Deity does is you're not so much the outline type as you are the jump right in and see where it goes kind of type.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, there are times where I think to myself, maybe I should actually write an outline. Because I don't really do that. And I also do think that my writing probably would be better in some areas if I did. But I find that everything changes so much for me as I'm writing that having a more vague stream of consciousness roadmap helps me more. Because if I say, okay, this is how the story's going to go and this is how I'm going to write it, I'm going to box myself in.
A lot of writers say that. A lot of the discovery writers and what they call the pantsers say that they can't do the outlines because they don't want to get locked in. But you aren't locked in. Like, I write my outlines and they are my blueprint. And by the time I actually sit to write the outlines itself, I have ran this movie from the beginning to the end in my head. But when you start actually writing it, it is going to change. I have never put together an outline that stayed the same. I just use it, it's sort of my blueprint so that I kind of stay on track with key points and key beats that I wanted to meet. And by the time you get characters talking and doing whatever they're doing, you realize, oh shit, that does have to change. That thing you have coming up isn't going to work, or it's not going to work the way you initially envisioned it, and then you just change it. I used to just go straight through. I used to not work with an outline. I can't do it now. I don't even know how I did it before. It has definitely changed my writing. It not only changed it in a really good way, but it also made me more productive. So whereas it may have taken me a couple months to knock something out, it does not now.
I think that's one of
And
the
I mean
keys.
the writing part of it. I'm not talking about the whole getting it together and conceptualizing
Sure.
it. The writing doesn't take me any time now.
I think that's one of the keys with an outline that I learned. Is like when you think of an outline in terms of a roadmap that's going to outline every turn you're going to take to get to your destination, it's going to be rigid. It's not going to work. But you have to consider that the outline also keeps you from going on a path that you know you don't want to go down. It kind of helps you narrow your focus. It helps you eliminate some paths that you don't need to go down. It doesn't really dictate every twist and turn you're going to make. And once I started doing that, I feel like my productivity ramped up quite a bit.
It's almost
It's a game changer.
it's almost like when you get really good at outlining, you kind of see the pages in your head before you actually bang them out. So I have carpal tunnel in both my hands, so like I can't like type that much, right? Because it hurts, like it just does. So there's certain discomfort. So I have to be very economic with the process. So that was a big adjustment for me. But you'll know. Like I've been in a writer's room with another writer who, you know, she was like USC film school, whole thing, and you know she outlines everything, and we'll just be talking about it, and we'll just guess how we think the scene's gonna go before we write it, you know, and it's not like a one-to-one perfect match, but you can kind of feel. I don't know if Ken and Deide you'd feel this way, but when you really get good at outlining, it's like you can kind of feel the shape the story has in that moment, like more or less, and it just
Yeah.
kind of.
You're
How,
right.
how,
But there's like, you're
how,
not.
how precise should, sorry, real quick, because I'm a little, for
Okay.
people who don't know this, outlining sounds powerful, but it sounds like there's an art to how precise you want to be. I'm assuming this
that's
isn't the kind of
what I was
outline
gonna
where you have
say.
like multiple indentions and you've worked at every phrase. So
No.
how wordy is an outline for you?
You don't want to read, you don't want to tell the story twice. A lot of people make that mistake. They think their outline is like summarizing and making a giant synopsis. Don't do that to yourself. I mean, you can, but I'll give you an example, like, because like I know my story, Shattered. Shattered is the novel that just came out. Well, it didn't just come out, it's got a year anniversary on it. And if you read it, like the first, I write enough words to know what that scene is going to be. For instance, the first scene in the book, it says standing at the bus stop. And that is all it says. The next one is enters the school. Whenever my scene changes, I make a sentence. I try to do it 5 words or less to what that scene is, and that's all I need. There are rare instances where I may write a little more. If there was something key that had to go in that scene, then I may make a note. But it's like went here, did that, dinner. You know, I don't. My outlines are not summaries. If
It
someone
really
was
is more
to
just,
read one,
these
they
are the
would not
scenes
know
I
what was.
want. I want this scene, I want this scene,
Yeah,
I want
you
this
wouldn't
scene, I
know what
want
was
this scene.
going on just reading my outline. You would not have a clue as to what's going on, but I know what needs to go there. So like when
Yeah.
I have one of my parts of the outline says in the chapel. There's a whole lot of stuff that went down in the chapel, but I know what they are. I don't have to write that out. I just need to know that it goes here. It's a blueprint. It's a guideline for me. Now I do have summaries and stuff like that, but it's not something I work with as far as writing the script itself.
All right.
Yeah, because that's
Justin
like
and Ken, or Matt, what about
yeah,
you? You were gonna
that's
say?
more work. If you're too detailed in your outlines, it kind of ruins the experience of writing for me. Because like I don't know about you guys, but for me, the real fun begins right after the first slug line. You know, like I'm a huge pre-writer. I do like I mean, I spent like 3 to 4 months pre-writing just for a short. You know what I mean? And I, honest to God, I hate it, but it's really important because the biggest challenge you're going to have as a writer is having too many choices to make. Because you're basically going to have to go through the ether of infinite possible ideas, and all of them could be right, and there's all of them that could be wrong too. So the best way to do it is just to like clearly outline, and among other things like character development, stuff like that, and plot outlining. But if you're too detailed in it, then it's going to ruin the spontaneity of it when you're in your scenes. Like when you're writing like a bar scene or something where 2 people are meeting, you more or less know like, okay, they're meeting for this reason, what the purpose of the scene is. But once you get into the dialogue, if you have it all outlined, then it's just like rewatching a movie. You know what I mean? Like you don't want to read the cliff notes of a movie before you watch it. You want to just get the quick premise and then watch the movie. Because that's what it's like when you're writing. You want that spontaneity, so that way you yourself feel surprised. Like once you get into it, because otherwise your
This
audience.
keeps you on track.
Yeah.
Well, so
If you've done it well, it keeps you on track. It doesn't retell the story.
how detailed is your outline then, Matt? Is it something like Deities where it's just a brief sentence per scene, or
Yeah,
or
so
more or less?
I wouldn't even consider mine an outline. I would call it a beat sheet.
Yeah.
Literally, what it is it's just like the scene, and maybe like I literally limit myself intentionally to like 1 to 2 sentences per one, because like I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to do that. So I keep it very concise with like 1 or 2 sentences. And it also helps me really focus in on like what is the purpose of this scene. Why am I showing this person going grocery shopping, or meeting this person or whatever? It can't just be to drive the plot. It has to also be to drive the meaning behind the plot as well.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, I guess.
Please.
Okay. So I just went back and looked at the last outline I did, and we did it as sticky notes. You can use a program called Miro, which if you guys have ever done I don't know. And guys, if you're in chat and this is useful or not useful, I guess let us know. I don't know where all the people listening to this are as writers, because I just want
Assume that there are everyone with the full spectrum of experience. No experience,
Okay.
tons of experience, everything in between.
Okay. So Matt's right. So there was or sorry, I don't mean right, but like that's pretty industry standard. It's like the sentence of what happens in that scene. And Matt kind of hit onto, I think the most important thing is like, you really want the core nugget, the real kind of core of what happens in that moment. So I guess my favorite example of this is like, characters it's not that like, Adam tells Eve he loves her. It's like Adam confesses his feelings. The scene isn't telling something. It's not like it's not like a teaching lecture. It's a confession for that character. Like that's the action. It's like they've been holding it back and now it's pouring out. And so even like really kind of simple things like that really help you when you're lost in the scene.
Right, they really
It's
do.
like, yeah, are they interrogating? It's like he asks him, like, where's the money? It's like, no, he interrogates John about the location of the mine. It's an interrogation. Like, you want to find the most pure and dramatic and interesting way to frame that scene. So when you're in that scene, you know how to build it, because you know what that scene's trying to accomplish, for me. And I did like there was like a free writing class from Zakiya Alexander, who's like, she's the screenwriter. She works on all kinds of shit. Like, you can pull up her IMDb. She was on 24 for a while, but she was like, she did, this was very specifically like playwright to screenwrite workshop, but she works as a TV writer. She lives in LA, New York. Like, I mean, that's all she does is write TV shows. So she was saying like the beat sheet is standard, and it's always basically just the one sentence of what happens in that scene. Like, someone interrogates someone, finds this, that leads them to that, like bang, 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 bang. It's not, it's not like the shitty novella of your of your screenplay.
Yeah, but I would say, just touching on that, a lot of people, they do get in, like, I guess, like, there's essentially kind of two types of writers. There are the writers like Levi, who get into the story and they figure it out as they go along, and that works.
Right.
I don't know how he does it. I don't know how they do it, but he can do it. That's great. But the other type are the pre-planners and whatnot. And I would say, like, at least for me, where I start, a lot of you, when you were asking, like, do you start at the beginning or the end? Neither. I start with the entire thing. I literally, what I do is I'll like have a general idea, like, people in this future scenario no longer can have babies, right? So like kind of like that. But then what I do is I literally distill that down into a log line. And then what I do is I develop a premise to that log line. Like, some people might call a premise like just a one sentence of what your story is, but I consider a premise an arguable truth that can be debated. So like blind ambition leads to ruin or something like that. Like that's the perfect example for Macbeth or whatever, right? And that can technically be in some ways argued because maybe that blind ambition is leading to something great, right? So you have a story about a guy who's like blindly ambitious about like doing something positive for the world, right? That's a great thing. But on the other hand, what will he sacrifice? What kind of relationships and stuff like that? That's a story right there because it can be argued. And so what you do, at least what I do, is I'll take that premise and then I will develop my designing principle, which is a fancy way of saying what is my strategy for supplanting that arguable truth into the log line. So that way you don't just have a plot that's interesting, you also have a plot that argues indirectly through the character actions and the dialogue that takes place. And I don't know, for me, that's sort of the secret sauce to like bringing meaning out of your stories, so that you don't just have like, something where somebody goes and does this and that, and then all this crazy stuff happens in the end.
Just for reference,
think
there's
for
a
me- I'm sorry, Ken, go ahead.
just for reference, Matt made me think of that's a key distinction between an outline versus a beat sheet. Blake Snyder has a beat sheet that a lot of people have used for a while back. And one of the things that I found very useful in it, I don't use it anymore, but one of the things that I stick with is that he also put what you're calling the premise, I think he stated was a theme. As he outlined the scenes, he said, here's the key point topic area of the scene that I need to cover, location, here's the purpose, but he also had, a reference to what was the theme of the film. And that's something that, to your point, as you start to really get into the nuts and bolts of creating the story, putting together with your characters, that really can inform, that changes what the characters do, given the circumstances you put them in. If this is that question, that thematic question that you raise or want to answer, it's going to dictate what happens in the story, what happens when you start really digging down into the nuts and bolts.
That helps you make the choices that you need to make, and in not just major choices, but the individual little tiny choices, like how do they turn their alarm clock off when they wake up and you see that opener, right? Are they homely and, or are they very neat and whatnot? Like what kind of clothing they wear, all of those things and the major choices that they make should ideally really just sort of tie back to that, that strong premise.
Yeah. To piggyback on that, another thing that is great, especially when you start writing more and more, is like lean on the other departments. Like characters don't need a lot of language if they have great wardrobe and set design for their space. They just don't. Like, if you guys have ever seen No Country for Old Men, there's that great scene, and if not, watch it. It's a fantastic film. But there's a great scene where he's trying to find Josh Brolin's character who just ran off, and he goes to like the woman who runs the kind of what do you call it? Like trailer park basically. And he's just like, where is he? And she's like, I told you he's not here. And like she has like 4 lines, but her space, they're in her office, so they're in her space. And that design is so effective. Like she doesn't really need a lot. And like you give it to a good professional actor who's been working for a long time, like they don't need a lot to establish the character. You can do that very quickly, very efficiently.
I put a lot of work into my characters. And it's one of those things where you don't really see necessarily, I don't know how to say that right. Like I do backstory on a character where it could be like they fell off a tricycle at 3, they're afraid of the color red, stuff like that. And you don't even necessarily know that in the story, but I make it a part of the character so that when they're moving in their story, they're true to who they are and they can't waver. And that's how I keep my story on track as well, because if I have a character who is afraid of dogs and a dog comes into the scene, they're going to react a certain kind of way, even though I never established, and like I never wrote something with, oh, they're afraid of dogs. You know this now by how they're reacting, if that makes sense. But one of the ways that drives me writing the story itself, once I figured out who the character is and I put them in the situation that I want them to be in, and I kind of know what I want to say at the end, you know, I throw them on like Harmon's wheel and answer those 8 questions. And it's just like gold for me. As soon as I get, especially when I get to the price and I'm determining what the price is going to be in the story, no matter what that is, it sparks everything else that happens. So I do a lot of pre-work before I start writing the script. And that's, it's not, it's probably not anywhere near as deep as Matt. It probably
No.
is. I don't know, because I don't know, but you know, like I build a whole bunch of stuff before I start letting the people start doing anything in the film itself, if that makes sense. I already know that this character is this and this character is that. They can only be who they are, but now let's put these 2 characters alone in a cabin and they're trapped. What's gonna go down?
And I think
And I
that
do the price.
I personally think that's a huge, that's one of the ways I don't specifically write down an outline. I have a general idea of where I want things to go, but so much of what I do is saying, okay, who are these people? Who are these people? Why? What defines them? What are they worried about? What are they worried about? What are they willing to compromise on? And what are they not? And what do they want? And I think that, and now I think those first two are great for your character. That third is absolutely friggin' necessary. What does your character want? If your character does not want anything, why are they in this film?
Yeah, what they want, give it to them and make them pay.
And that's the thing. It's like what you have to define that. And it'll get to the point. Joe Kubert, who is a comic book writer, he wrote Sergeant Rock and DC's War comics for years and years and years. And he said it kind of got to the point when we were on the book where someone would pitch a story and someone else in the writing room would say, Rock's not that kind of GI. He wouldn't do that. And we realized we were talking about a fictional person as if they were in the room. So the thing is, I feel that you ought to be able to make your characters to a point where you're like, nah, Rock's not that kind of GI. It's like, that doesn't make sense. You say, well, what if they did this? Well, that doesn't make sense because that's not what they want. That doesn't jive with their character. That doesn't jive with their ideals, what they're willing to bend for, what they aren't willing to bend for. So I feel that there's so many dead ends that you can start trimming and saying, no, that won't happen, that won't happen, that won't happen. Because the people that are in this scene, this guy would never say that. He would never put it like that. Or this person would never act that way. And I feel that eliminates so many situations in my head. And as I'm writing, I just kind of steer in to character. I steer into what I think they would do in that situation. And sometimes it comes out great. Sometimes I read it back and I'm like, that doesn't make much sense. So I have to rewrite it. But I think that clears up so much is when you are going in and answering those 3 questions. What are they afraid of? Where do their ideals lie? And what do they want?
Yeah, I use personality theory for that to outline my characters. It's kind of like the Myers-Briggs, but like more up to date. And it's about, well, the Myers-Briggs doesn't work. I don't know if you guys have known that. Like, you just need to bury it behind the shed. Like,
Oh, really? I love Myers-Briggs.
it doesn't predict anything.
Tell me why.
It doesn't predict anything in any circumstance observably anywhere ever. Like, it's just, so personality theory is kind of a little bit more brute force, but also more accurate. It has about 30 characteristics. So it's like, open-mindedness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And those all break down into 6 categories. And I always give them just like a point scale from 1 to 10 for my principal characters. I'm not doing this for my side characters. So I'll do like, I'll just know like how open-minded, how open are they to new experiences? And it's like the story kind of becomes in a little way, it's like, okay, well, what's the one thing that changes? You know what I mean? And like, how much do they have to go through to change? Because stories are kind of about who people are, but they're also about who they become and how they become them. You know, it's like how people form into the people they become.
Yeah, for me, I do. I don't know really how to describe it, but I guess it's based on John Truby's Anatomy of Story. He didn't have a name for it either, so I just call it kind of what it is, which is, you know, creating engines for your characters, or a character engine. Which that's basically saying, like, how do you create a character that can actually move in your plot, that has that agency to move instead of just being passive. And what I do is I just sort of answer the questions like, what is their weakness, which can be broken down into 2 types. Like, there's the physical manifestation of their weakness, like maybe they're perfectionist, or, you know, I guess the best way to say it is like, take a drug addict. Their physical weakness would be they're addicted to drugs, they steal, and they don't have any responsibility, and yada 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 and so forth. But their moral weakness would be like, they're deeply ashamed of themselves, right? Or like they don't think very highly of themselves, right? So you kind of have to break the character's weakness down to like a physical weakness, which is what are the physical manifestations of this deeper weakness, which is, I would, you know, call it the moral weakness. And then from that, I create a lie that they tell themselves. So like the drug addict, you know, they're going to come up with excuses for why they take the drug, like, oh, it helps relieve stress, or, you know, it helps with my creativity, or yada and so forth. And so that's sort of the lie they tell themselves throughout the story, to hide from why their weakness is holding them back. And then I develop a desire, which is like the physical desire, like in the story. You know, if say it's like an Olympic player or whatever, right? His desire is to win the gold medal at the Olympics. And then I create a need from there, which is, what do they need? What do they need to do in order to reveal that deeper weakness, to understand how their strength, like their drug addiction, is actually a real weakness. And then I basically just take all that and sort of summarize it, which creates your character arc right there, for every single act.
Let me actually sort of dive a little deeper into that. So what I'm hearing is that characters and character traits are very important, that you have a really good idea of how these characters are actually structured, both how they appear to people and how they are inside. So I guess what I'd ask is, like, what are your general tricks, techniques for revealing that? Like, when do you reveal their surface characteristics? How do you do that? And then, you know, is it important that your primary character have a deeper motivation that is revealed later? And then how do you do that?
That would depend on the last part, which you said would depend on what story I'm telling. I write a lot of tragedies, so a lot of this, the key elements of their personality will bounce back and forth, and it'll reveal and then kind of fake reveal at the same time, and the audience finds out at the end when everybody else finds out. But for me, like I said before, the key thing that keeps me going with the writing, with the telling the story itself, is the character development. Like they were saying, like once I know my character, I can put them in any situation and tell that story, if that makes sense. So I can, whatever the theme of the tale is going to be, I don't have a hard time writing it once I did all that back work.
So it's less like I'm trying to get across that this character is fastidious, so I have to put this character doing this thing, and more just you keep in your mind this character is fastidious, and then in that situation they just act in a way, you know what I mean? Like, so they're just themselves,
They can
and
only
you're
be
not
who they
concerned about
are.
revealing that.
They
Is that
can
what you
only
mean?
be they can only be who they are, and we all can only be who we are. If the 5 of us were put in the room and then I don't know, the room started filling with water, we're all going to react a certain way because we are who we are.
Yeah.
And that's what I make sure I do before I put my characters in the room filling up with water, that I defined who they were before they got there.
Yeah. So Wes, to go back, just to give you like an in progress example of how I would approach that. So you give me a fastidious character, right? Is it a principal or supporting? Principal?
Principal.
Okay. So for me, if I had a fastidious character, I would think, where can I put fastidiousness as a human quality in greater conflict with the environment and the other people in the story? So let's say they're a consultant who's like brought in to fix, and give me a genre too. Let's do like a exercise.
I feel like I'm doing an improv exercise. Okay, what am I supposed to give you? A what? A situation? A
Give me a
genre.
Yeah.
Let's go comedy, definitely.
Okay, so like a human comedy, I would do a fastidious consultant who is the principal character in a movie where he is trying to fix like a company that's down on its luck and like about to go under, and all the other characters are just like bumbling idiots, right? So they're not neat and organized, and his driving principle is organization to an almost like anxious degree. And so the disorder around him would put his, if fastidiousness for whatever reason is kind of his core characteristic, then that environment will put his core character in conflict, and that will drive the story. Like that's how I would do it. To Matt's principal point, why is he fastidious? And then it's like that becomes kind of the emotional core of the story. It was like he grew up in a disorganized household, or he grew up in a hyper organized household, and he like associates his value as a person somehow with this quality of organization or order, or he just cannot deal with uncertainty in his life because he really does have a fear and he has to plan everything. Something like that. You could go a couple different ways. Obviously,
the point is to highlight, is to make these character traits dramatically, narratively relevant.
Yeah, I would, if you're like, that's the first thing you think of where you're like, oh yeah, Ken, yeah, he's a really fastidious guy, just like as an example, right? If that's his core character, the thing that really jumps off the page for it, then yeah, you would want to like butt heads with it or something. And he would either change himself and like learn to let go, or people would kind of see, like it would probably happen both ways.
Right,
Like
right.
he would kind of let go and people would kind of see his point, and they kind of meet in the middle, and you would resolve if it's a comedy, like everyone gets laid at the end, right? So
Important.
yeah, so he like bangs the girl and like lets things go, and they go fishing, and like his boots get muddy, right? Like just you depends how big or small this story is,
If it's television,
The why definitely is the core to how everything's moving.
Yeah.
You gotta ask why.
I personally disagree. I
Yeah.
don't think the why is nearly as important as the what. Because the thing is that on screen, I don't need to know why a lot of it. I don't need to know why a character is the way he is. You as the writer can know that. You as the writer can understand a why, but the thing is, I don't feel that why is always incredibly important to the narrative, because
Let's
then you
see.
It's important to
then
me
you
as
get
a writer to in the
because
writing
then
of it.
you get to the point. I feel like you can get to the point where you're starting to get into your own head, where why becomes the only thing, instead of where we start focusing on what. Where there can be too much there can be too much what in plenty of movies, where you're just like, what is happening? I have no idea what's happening. None of this is established.
Why are these bullets going backwards? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Me knowing why and me answering why is my part of my writing process.
Yeah.
Even if you don't really fully understand why, I have to have why.
yeah,
And
I'm with
Okay.
Maggie.
Yeah.
I don't know if the audience would, like, they don't have to know it, but they have to
They don't
feel
have to know
it.
it.
And
And
I'm not particularly sure if they would feel it if you didn't have like some awareness.
well,
So in
and that
Pixar, the guiding principle in Pixar is, what's the big beautiful question this story is trying to answer? And that's how they crux all their movies.
and that's different. I feel that you ought to know why, but that why shouldn't always make it to the page.
Yeah,
I-
no,
I-
we all agree on that. I think.
Yeah,
but I
we
think, we
actually
need-
agree.
but I think we need to define real quick, what do we mean by why? Because initially I disagreed with your statement, Levi, but now I understand your version.
Okay.
So like, so there is the significance of the story itself, right? So like the way that, what really profoundly changed the way I write is when I was listening to this podcast on Script Notes by John August and Craig Mason, and Craig Mason really did a great analysis. He was the guy who did Chernobyl, the new series that came out a little bit ago.
And also Rocket Man.
Yeah, he did, and that stuff. Like, he's an extremely talented guy, and he really broke down, like, because like when you read a screenplay writing book and when you hear everything that we're talking about, you're hearing like, well, you want to design your plot and you want to not make sure your characters aren't passive, and character engines and designing principle, and you get all these like terms and whatnot, and how to actually do stuff and structure your story. But like, nobody really ever sits there and explains like, okay, but why are we doing this? Like, why do we even write stories? And the way that I've come to learn is that stories are basically just another way of expressing philosophy without having to have people read a boring academic paper, right? Because nobody wants to read a boring academic paper. All those philosophers just talk to themselves. But we as writers and filmmakers love reading about that stuff. So we want to take all of that stuff and all of our personal experiences, and we want to reappendage all of that into something that is both entertaining, interesting, engaging. And the way that we do that is we basically create an argument for and against these philosophical beliefs indirectly through characters and plot. So like, your protagonist may be fastidious. If your protagonist is fastidious, then it makes sense that your antagonist, your main opponent, would be the opposite of him. So, and it could be a business partner, not somebody who's a competitor or something. So your opponent may not be an obvious opponent. It may be somebody who is like on Death to Smoochie, right? Where Robin Williams was this like old kids show host or whatever who was all washed out, and then you have this really good guy, Edward Norton, as like, the person who takes his place. Well, in that story, Edward Norton may be the ideal person that everybody wants to be like, but he's still the opponent of that story, and so in all of that design is to basically espouse like some sort of philosophical, like arguable truth, right? Countering that arguable truth through action and dialogue and through an antagonist and whatnot, so that by the end of it, your character grows in a synthesis of a new, or new part of that truth ends up forming by the end. see it, but like I would highly recommend checking out that podcast episode.
What was the podcast?
It is called Script Notes. Just look up Craig Mason's breakdown of like, story, and
Dude, just listen to all of them. They're all very valuable.
they're all great, but man, that one really just completely changed.
I'm just posting these in the chat for
Yeah,
Good deal.
Okay, cool.
So I just wanted to say a couple of things on character to your original question. The question was, when do you start to show characteristics of your character? And depending on your genre, I'm a genre guy. So for me, it's every second of the story. You never let up. If you're doing comedy, if you're doing horror, if you're doing action, you set those characteristics and you show them constantly. But one trick that I've personally found that works really well for me is beyond the looking at the hero's journey, looking at Sigmund Freud and all these different ways to say, how do I set up a character? Just as writers, one of the things, like to Matt's point, we're creating these stories so that we can create empathy for other people, so we can educate, but usually above all to entertain. So for me, it's like, if I go out in public, and I know it's difficult for a lot of writers as we're introverts, if I'm out in public and I see a real character, like my uncle's a really funny guy. At Thanksgiving, he has a way of saying things. He has a worldview that is really crass. He's a character. So if I need to create a character, I'm going to look at this real life person and I'm going to exaggerate it. I'm going to take pieces from my own life. I'm going to take pieces from my own life experience, because that to me that's the secret sauce. Because we all can read the books that tell us how to outline. We can all read the books that tell us how to set up subtext. But what other writers can't do is they can't have your life experience. So what you're doing is you're taking that bit of life experience, you're taking little pieces. You also got to be a little bit schizophrenic. You got to take a little piece of yourself and throw them into, your bad guy. You can't just say, oh, he's darkness and evil. You have to figure out what his passion is, what he wants, and that sets up his character, and that shows his characteristics. And you go, oh, I had a middle school teacher that was an absolutely evil person, and she was hey, and now that tick is going to be a tick that my bad guy is going to have. And that's the thing that, like, for us, when you do this long enough, you start to go, first, what you're going to do is you're going to say a character, oh, I saw Star Wars, so my character is going to have a black mask and a funny voice and wear a cape. And then after you do it long enough, you start to say, I'm pulling together all these different elements, and I'm pulling together and creating a character that no one's ever seen before, because I have a unique worldview. And that's the responsibility of the writer.
Well, and I think you kind of hit on something that I do as well. Every character I've ever written is equal parts someone I've known, something I've read, and a little bit of me. Because the thing is, I think all of us have encountered enough people in our life that we could fill out any cast.
Absolutely.
The thing is that it's taking a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B, and saying, I worked with this one guy, and he always had this way of reacting with things. And you know what? I had this other coworker or this other person that I met at this point, and then bringing it into one person.
Levi, we can't keep telling people these secrets are like no one's gonna tell them. They just know, like, they just know they're gonna be in some screenplay somewhere.
Dude, why do you I tell no one at work that
Literally at this point in my life, every single X has been some type of character. Like, they know. Like, I told them, like, just so you know, like, I kind of remember this thing about you, and but they're all nice.
Well, and that
I wish I could say that I do not. If you end up in my book or in my script, because you did something that I didn't think was right.
Yeah, I haven't told them. I haven't told them.
Yeah,
I love to. And the other thing that I would always hear from people that used to drive me crazy, which it drives me crazy because I'm guilty of it. But it was like, oh no, don't put yourself in your stuff, because if you're doing self inserts and this and that and blah blah blah, I'm like, I am a part of every single character I've ever written. So what does that say? Like did I do something to hit? Can y'all still hear me?
yeah, we can.
Oh, okay. I don't know, I hit something. But yeah, when I'm writing, all of my characters have little pieces of me, like I'm peppering in. They're all Frankenstein.
Well, and
All Frankenstein.
the way that I see it, if I have to feel a character. I have to feel them. Because the thing is that it's like, how can I write someone who is passionate about something if I cannot put my passion into it? How can I write someone who is in the midst of an angry rant if I don't understand why they're angry? So the thing is that there's so much of, and it's sometimes it's just a little kernel of who you are. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's just a little bit. But it is being willing to be vulnerable enough to say, this is something that I can see the fear in, or this is something that I can see the anger in,
That you relate to.
or the joy or the passion or anything else. It's about putting just a little bit in there, maybe one of your experiences, maybe one of your emotions, or someone, or having them bounce off of someone that you know, and having that type of interaction. It's coming from a place of saying, not only do I understand this mentally as a writer, but I understand this as a person, because people will connect with that.
Right.
I think that there is nothing worse that you can do as a writer than to write a character that is feeling all of these things, and your entire audience and you sit there and you're like, it's words on a page.
Yeah, so you have to basically be a person if you want to be a writer.
Write that down. That's a good one. I actually,
Good facsimile of one at least.
I would actually kind of like to change direction just a little bit, because I've had this actually come up to me a lot. I love everything we've discussed in terms of writing and fantastic. I would like to be a little bit more focused on Charm City stuff. I mean, specifically, what is different about writing a short than writing a feature, than writing a series, than writing a novel, than writing a play? How is a short? What do you do? How is a short different?
Shorter.
One thing for me, I think,
Let me write that down.
I'll let you know
Shorter.
when I
Okay.
figure
So
it
you just
out.
write to page 10 and then stop. Got it.
one thing for me that I like when I see, I enjoy when I see shorts. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to pull one off with that done that yet. Is that I mean, films and plays, they're like novels. They're something you want to sit down and you want to be in them. Shorts are literally, to Justin's point, short. It's the kind of entertainment you get. Like if you sit down at a bar and somebody tells you a story. I mean, think of how somebody tells you a story. They started off with an interesting premise. They tell you here's some interesting details in the middle, and then they hit you with a zinger at the end. And that's what I think a lot of shorts miss, is that, it's a succinct tale that has a neatly wrapped beginning, middle, and end. It's not necessarily an exploration on the meaning of the universe. It's usually it's almost like whether it's horror, drama, it's like it's got a punchline, almost like a good joke.
It's like
That's a good way to put it.
it's a punch in the face. It's a very potent thing.
It does seem like a lot of horror films end on a jump scare.
Yeah.
And the monster. And
It's the same exact. It literally, like, the difference between a novel and a short screenplay is different, but like the difference between a short screenplay and a feature, it's the same exact thing. Really, the only difference is, again, you're just condensing it down, which, for some people, it's a lot harder. Like Chris Nolan, obviously that's very hard for him to do because he has so much to say. For somebody like me, that's way easier to be
Nothing to say.
Oh my God, I can't believe it. You
Like
think
10
it's easier.
bring it down to 10 minutes.
It's so hard for me. It is so hard.
I'm
Shorts
sorry.
are
I'm
so
sorry. You're
hard
gonna
for
hate
me.
you.
Well, writing a short is easier.
I don't
Writing a
have the
good one.
touch of that or whatever it is, because the minute I come up with an idea for a story, and in my brain I'm going, oh, I can make a short about blah blah blah, and all I have to do is have that thought before it turns into like a 3-book miniseries. I can't do it. It's so hard for me.
Yeah.
And then taking a big story and making it smaller is even harder. The only success that I've really had with short stories is if they started short and remain that way. Because I'm going to be in the anthology. I actually got in. I don't know how I got in for publishing house. I can't really talk about it. But I took one of my big stories. I said I'll just turn that into a short story. It's a monster. It's killing me. I do not have the gift. Short stories, and people who do them are brilliant. I can't shine in short stories. I'm the chick at the campfire in the old days in some ancient life with the cane, and I'm telling my story, and they have to come back every day for a month to get the whole story. I can't do it.
Well, the one thing that makes, and to me, the one thing that's easier about a short story is that, for the genre folks, and Levi probably can speak to this. When you're talking about something like horror, where where you're setting up, if you do a long form, you gotta do all the character work, you gotta come up with all this mythology. Whereas a short, it's just you just can kind of dig into the hook. What's the hook of the scare, the monster, the creature. So that's one thing that I guess is like your hook can be pure cotton candy. You can just you can eliminate all the work and just say, I'm only going to concentrate on the parts that are fun. And that's to me,
yeah,
that's what separates the shorts. Because like I said, the shorts that I end up forwarding to people, I don't go, oh, that was some brilliant acting. There's probably I can think of probably like 2 shorts in the past 5 years that I've seen and say, hey, that was some really good acting. But most of the shorts that I end up forwarding on is that was a really funny punchline, that was a really funny jump scare, that was a really interesting monster ghost chasey thingy.
It's the hook. You like the hook. Is that what you're saying?
Say again?
It's the hook you like.
Well, yeah, I think that's the thing is with the short, it's like you really don't have time to do much else but play up the hook.
I think for any story, you just have to know how much air it needs. Because even in longer form stuff, I've definitely seen things where I'm like, this just feels like a mini series that someone tried to squeeze into 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the biggest thing for the people who are starting to write for Charm City is, this is my personal recommendation, but if you have there's this story that I love and I've always wanted to tell it, if it's not a short, don't make it a short. It's not gonna, I don't know. You might have to make sacrifices you're not happy with.
Right, I 100% agree on that.
Yeah, and there's just some things you can't do in 10 minutes. It just needs, some things need 45, some things need 90, some things need 2 hours, some things need 6 episodes. It's just the project I'm working on now, kind of go back to the project that it was with a historian who told me this whole thing. And he's like, I was thinking about making it into a movie. And I was like, there's no way. I'm like, it's just too much. I'm like, this is at least 8 hours of material.
Would be a very expensive mistake too.
Yeah. Oh my God. You'd never see that money again.
Okay, well, so that's a good question. How do you determine the scope of ideas? So you're sitting there, you're driving along in the shower, singing yourself, whatever, and you come up with an idea and you start to it starts to unravel, you start to feel it. Is it early in that process where you go, nope, this is a TV show that has to go 10 seasons, and you then, okay, I'm gonna set that aside and then wait till the next short comes, or is that deeper in your process?
I mean, for me personally, and I'll just do this quickly, the nice thing about shorts is they don't take very long to write. So, if I don't like the 10 pages, I'll just be like that. And what just happened? I'll just start it. I write 8 pages, 9 pages, finish it. And I'm just like, I don't think this is worth my time. And I'll keep the idea and just save it as a PDF. And then when I have time, I'll try the feature.
I can say for me that the shorts that I have been successful on, the ending always came to me. And so because I could see what the ending was, I can count the pages forward. Does that make sense? Those were the only, my most recent short, I already knew how the thing had to end. I just had to get people to the end. So I didn't have to put a lot into, I put stuff into the backstory, but I didn't have to put it in the story itself. They had to show up, do what they had to do, and then it was over. So I guess for me, like I said, a couple of times, because shorts are not my strength, that I was fortunate the ending was there. It was fully in line, and I just had to make sure that when I went backwards to write it, that I just didn't go too far back.
I would say it's two things for me. How big is your problem? And how many beats does it take for this to make sense? Because the thing is, determining how big your threat is, how big your problem, is that a threat to one person? Well, if it's a threat to one person, I would say, well, okay, we now know the size of the scale, the physical scale of your story. Is it a threat to a neighborhood, a state, a country, the world? How big within the actual scope of your story is your threat? So that can sometimes determine how much time it will actually take. But the other thing is, how many beats is it going to take for any of this to make sense, or how many beats does it take for me to care?
And I think it's just as simple as, again, it's that guy sitting on a bar stool telling you a story, or you're at a campfire, somebody's telling you a story. Can you get across the premise, the themes, and the plot of your short in a conversation? I mean, if you imagine yourself sitting across the table just telling some kids a story, is it something that you'd be able to get through before they all fell asleep? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just that simple. You got, I think a lot of us, we approach shorts as mini movies, and we want to make Tenet in 7 minutes, and it's just not going to happen.
You couldn't even do Tenet.
You couldn't do Tenet in 8 hours backwards, actually.
That was like a mini series to me. That was like a mini series that got condensed.
Well, and the thing is, I feel on it. Honestly, I do feel like this, but then again, features is depending on how you do filmmaking are like this as well. I feel that shorts appeal far more to the eye and the heart than they do the brain. It's the difference, but it's the difference between like a single that's on the top 40 and an opera. One has to hit you hard. It has to hit you fast. It has to evoke something in you.
I feel like it's all dessert.
Yeah, it's like
not the 7 courses.
Dessert.
Is it a
I like that.
is it a dance song
that
I want to get up and go? Is it a sad song? I'm crying my eyes out. Am I supposed to be getting angry? I'm furious. One song has to serve a quick and easy purpose. Well, an opera can build and build and build and build and build and build and build. So the thing is it's so much about conveying a feeling in your short. That's why
good.
Personally, that's why I think we have horror, tragedy, falling out, things going wrong, people being at each other's throats, because they're universal.
One thing I want to add to what you just said,
because they're simple, and I feel that because people can grasp onto that and they can say, this has moved me. Because the thing is, you don't see many complex shorts out there. I don't often come away from a short and say, wow, that was a great story. I come away from a short saying, wow, I was scared, or that made me really happy, or that made me laugh. It's all about evoking a feeling, where a feature has to have a structure. It has to have all of these things that make sense and all of these characters in order to reach your end point. Where a feature has to appeal to the brain, a short has to appeal to the heart.
So I just want to add one more thing to what you just said, because that is very important to me, the emotional piece of the short. And I feel like, again, as from being with Charm City, one of the things that I've noticed is that I'm not going to speak for everyone else. I know that one of the things that I've tried to do is I've tried to flex my writing and directorial muscle. So when I want to get to that end of the 10 minutes, and I want people to see, oh, Ken can handle comedy, he can handle horror, he can handle acting, he can handle dialogue. And that's really not what we should be doing in these shorts. We should be saying, I can handle this emotion. I can handle this funny. I can handle this scary. I can handle this. And what we should be doing is we should be building up a repository of small films that can show different aspects of it, rather than, I feel like sometimes we run into this trap where we're trying to flex all of our muscles at once. And it probably works a little better when you say, I'm going to focus in on this energy here. That's the energy I want my audience to feel. And I'm going to deliver that to them in 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Interesting point.
Richard was asking, is there going to be a Q&A?
Yes. And
I-
go ahead.
No, I would say since being with Charm City and with all the stuff before Charm City, I've learned so much in honing stuff in. I still haven't gotten it all, but I've learned a lot in being able to tell a story without having to have like 50,000 scenes and all sorts of stuff. I think that Ken and Levi hit the nail on the head. It definitely is what the feeling that you get after you've watched it, and not necessarily all the tech stuff or the other stuff that can creep into longer verse.
All right. So yes, there will be a Q&A. Let's go ahead actually and open that up, because I asked all the questions I wanted to ask. So go ahead and post a question. Is there any, I feel like I know people already posted some, but I also honestly feel like a lot of those have been answered. So okay. So if does anybody have a question, please?
Roz,
Yes.
Roz, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, there's two things. One of the things is that when you talked about the why of something happening, for me personally, I like to know the why. I don't like to see just the action. I like to know the why. I don't need you to go back to every little nitty gritty detail of the person's life, but I do need to know, how did this person come to this place? That's for me personally. And the other thing I have a number of questions, but another question is that when you write a novel, when you're writing a story, not for filming, you can make your character be anybody, look different at different times. You can go anywhere in the world. You can go to the moon, to go to hell, anywhere. But when you're filming, my question to you, when you're writing, especially when you're writing a short story, do you keep in mind whether you can actually film this? Can you do this location? Does it affect your writing? Do you change your writing? Because sometimes when I think of a story to write, and I'm thinking about, but I think it'll be too hard to find this kind of location, too hard to do this. I may have to change my story a little.
That's such a great question. For me, if you'd asked me this, before we're doing stuff for Charm City, I never took anything into consideration. I just told the story I wanted. If they had to fly to Paris and all of the stuff, they just did. But I consciously write stuff that are inside what I think we can pull off without making it too hard on us. For instance, like I'll do when I did the last film that I shot, it all happened in one room. And I am conscious of that. The newest one is still all happening in one place. It's a little harder, but it's still happening in one place. Before I was not. I did whatever I wanted. Now I am way more conscious of how many people do I need. Let's not get overboard. Make one location that we can always use, kind of thing. So yeah, I do have that in mind when I'm writing new stuff.
If you hope to become a professional, that is something that you're going to have to be able to do. Because when you write something that's going to capture someone's attention, it's probably going to be something that you didn't limit yourself. It's probably going to be whatever you thought. And somebody's going to say, I love it. And they're going to come back to you and say, here's all the stuff you need to change now. Because we don't have $100 million for it.
Yep.
So that's the skill you may as well start learning now rather than later.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll have to write pages on set. If you're really a professional screenwriter, they'll just be like, these cars won't start, if we're going to shoot today, or we're going to lose millions of dollars, you got to rewrite the scene because of production purposes. So
yeah, and I always
ultimately a screenplay is only good if you can produce it. You know,
Yeah.
it's
It's
not
just the blueprint.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think you should always be conscious of like cost and whatnot, um but what I do is I usually like factor that in, but I don't let it dictate my decisions until after I've written everything, because like I always kind of go with the philosophy of, start big and then bring it down. You know what I mean? So like I will create the car chase scene, right? And this is a mistake I made with 1040 that John and I made with 1042, because we could have had a chase scene without the cars involved, right? But we really wanted to do that. We did it, but it was a lot of headache, and it was a lot more expensive. And but nowadays, when I write that, I write the car scene.
I
Oh,
think we're
sorry.
getting a little bit of echo from Dick and Ross from your mic.
Yeah. Yeah, but so like nowadays, like I guess the difference is like I'll still write that big car chase scene or that big scene where like somebody's head explodes or something like that. And then I'll go back and then I'll say, okay, logistically, does that work? Yeah, technically it does, but like how can we make it cheaper and easier and still effective? You know what I mean?
Right. I know what you mean. I limit myself now in my short stuff that I know that I personally want to shoot.
Yeah.
I definitely am conscientious. Stuff that I don't plan on shooting myself, I don't do that.
And
Yeah, but
to be clear,
Because
Matt,
I know that if something big that I wrote was going to go into production, it's going to get whittled. I know that. So I
And
don't want to whittle me from the start. But anything that I'm going to do personally, I definitely keep it
to
at a
be
box.
clear, Matt, it's like the skill set that you and John have as directors. What you have to, your limits are different from other directors in the group. So for myself, it's like I'm like, can I have this conversation shot from both sides of the table? And that's as complex as it's going to be for me. So, but again, it's what I'm writing for. If I'm writing for me as the director, then I already know what my limitations are, and I'm probably just going to go a little bit beyond my limitations. But if I'm writing in the hopes of winning the contest or the hopes that somebody else, like one of you guys, will direct it, I'm putting in starships and space battles, and there are no limits when I'm, writing creative.
But yeah, and it also depends too on like what is your motivation? Like, like I guess what are you trying to do with your career with writing? Because if you are trying to be a writer, director, producer, absolutely you need to be conscious of how much is it going to cost and how expensive it's going to be in making those decisions. But if you purely just want to be a writer and go to LA and work in a writer's room, then you can write a Jurassic Park feature length, script or whatever as a sample of your work to show that, hey, I can do this or whatever. So yeah, I mean, you have less limits, I guess, in what you can write if you just purely are writing to get a job as a writer. But then once you do actually become a writer, then people are going to come at you and be like, hey, you got to get rid of this like dinosaur.
and the
Jurassic Park, but no dinosaurs.
You're right.
Lovely.
the way that
We're just going to call it Central Park.
the way that I see it, and also to be fair, I will always, every time I make a film, every time I have tried to make something, I'm like, this is a really simple this is a really simple premise, and that turns into a special effects extravaganza every doggone time. But unfortunately, that's what I get for writing genre pieces. The thing is that I guess the way that I see it, your rough draft is free. Write your rough however you like. Hammer it out. Just get it on the doggone page. And when you have your rough in hand, you can then say, all right, what doesn't work, what doesn't make sense, and what can we not afford? Because the thing is, I feel that if you are writing particularly and strictly like it just singing in the back of your head, you can't do that, you're an indie director, you need less, you need less, you need less, you need less. I feel that in a way it'll kind of limit what you can do. I think it is far easier to have to just write what you want to write and then pull back afterwards and say, okay, this is the original vision. And if you come to that rough, if you come to your rough draft and you cannot bring yourself to cut anything, then that's not what you're making right now.
Well, when you're writing a short, then basically what you're saying is that you really need to write something that's contained, so that you start out maybe thinking in terms of being in one room or two rooms or in a smaller space or on the corner of the street, rather than expanding it into what you would write for a series or for a film.
Yeah. One set, if you can help it, one location.
Yeah, do you have a question or?
No, that was kind of my question to all the writers, was that if you are writing something and you're writing for, say, Charm City, then you're thinking and your first thoughts are containment because of the fact that you're only going to be writing maybe 5 or 6, 7 pages.
Yeah, like concurrently, I would say. Because again,
Alexa, stop.
because again, you want to be creative, you know what I mean? You don't want to have those constraints. So, like if you're writing for Charm City, don't even think about writing Jurassic Park. Don't even think about it.
Don't do it to yourself.
But
Right, Jurassic Park, just not for Charm
like
City.
cool John McClane action thriller, like it's okay to go a little big and then bring it down once like you talk to Wes or whatever, and then he'll just be like, yeah, we're not doing it.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of what I mean. Please actually write within your space here. But it is, you do have to keep in mind with those two things. How big is your threat, and how many points do I have to make before this makes sense? And if you are going to write your grand space opera, friggin' phenomenal. Please do hammer out that rough, baby. But you're not going to be able to make it here.
Maybe the trailer can be made here.
Yeah, you can't make it here.
Not the opera itself.
So in the case of specifically writing a short, I mean, yeah, keep it to a smaller story, but don't approach it from a place of, oh, I have to take an idea and I have to make it cost this much. Approach it from the idea of what is a smaller story, what is a smaller conflict, what is a smaller tale. So that way you aren't taking a big idea and smashing it down. You are taking a small idea and putting it into its proper box.
One other thing I recommend too is that one of the things that's beautiful about the group once we're through this situation is that you literally have the ability to go to other artists' sets and see what is difficult for them to do, what they pull off. You got a film school where you can show up on any one of these director sets and see what we can pull off, and you can take that back, and that can inform what you want to write. If you say, well, okay, I saw these guys, they had 2 locations, they ran out of time, they were only able to get one, then that might pull back your location. You say, well, we did one with the spaceship. You say, okay, well, maybe I can do something similar to that. So it's a great opportunity to not just, you don't have to limit your imagination without any context, because it's like you're all, in this situation is a unique situation where you're almost a part of a film production company, where you get to sit in the board room and talk about what the budget is for the film slate, and you can pretty much work with that to help inform what you're going to write and help you to kind of put constraints on, or in some cases it might even make you go, well, I can do a little bit more, because again, some of the things that I've been doing I've actually kind of been expanding what I've been putting in my films, because my films were pretty much was like, well, I'm terrified, so I'm just going to have two people talking. And now seeing what other people have been able to do, I'm like, well, maybe I'll try to pull that off too.
Let me actually ask you that real quick, because I know that I think pretty much everybody here, all 5 of you, have made more than one film with Charm City. Was your second film, your third film, was it more ambitious? Did it feel like, oh, well, let me move into a new space? Partially because you yourself were getting better at making films.
Mine was less ambitious, actually.
Okay, well, 1042 is hard to
You've got a
top.
unique situation.
1042 is a little.
Matt, you don't count because there's something wrong with you.
Mine was
My
There's
third
the guy who made it like a sci-fi epic, and it's like
Then I brought it down to like 2
a hotel room. Okay, yeah.
people.
For me, mine was more ambitious. I went from 2 people to 4.
I had 3 and 2 locations. That was pretty crazy. And
I shot on 2 days. Yeah, that was more.
yeah, I had 3 people, and I made it a lot easier by doing it in a theater, so you could just turn on the fucking lights.
I don't think mine got more ambitious, but the production itself just got smoother. If that makes any sense. Like it just got smoother. I'm sorry. Everyone, I have to go.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
I think we're almost. Does anyone else? Does anyone else have
another
questions?
question. I
Okay,
have another question.
Daddy, go ahead and go if you need to. Of course, thank you.
I find that a lot of the stories from, from Charm City have to do with either horror, tragedy, sci-fi, and not much of comedy. And my question is, do you find it difficult to write comedy? I'm waiting for a comedy that I can really laugh my head off. But I just find, is it easier for you to write the other genres rather than comedy?
Well, it's what's really weird is that so like comedy stories for me are harder because it's a story. Comedy skits are like probably the easiest thing any writer could probably do, because it's not really a story, it's really just a situation, like a hyperbolic character in a situation, and then you have another character or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess sci-fi action thrillers and stuff like that, like, would probably typically be easier to write because that's really what stories are. They're conflict written, you know? Even comedies are conflict written. So I guess it's like, technically, I mean, I guess it would be easier to like lean on conflict when you have an inherently conflicted story, like a thriller or something, as opposed to a comedy, because then it's like, well, how do you create conflict in a comedy? I mean, you can, you have to, but it's I guess it's just not as obvious. It's like, just like with an opponent, right? Like when you're thinking about an antagonist, your mind is automatically going to bad guy, sinister guy, terrorist or something like that, right? Somebody really bad, or some corporate dude who's like really, corrupt. That's your immediate like move to that. But an antagonist is way more complicated than that, especially in comedies, because an antagonist in those situations typically tend to be good people who just happen to be dating the person or whatever in this rom-com that the main character is trying to get or something, or it's just their rival, like on Death to Smoochie. But the bad guy is like a really good person, so it becomes a lot more complicated, and you really have to understand like what's behind a story to write a really effective comedy story, at least for me.
I think it's just going to depend on I think we all just have our different skill sets. I, for one, feel like although I tend to write horror, all my stuff's comedy at its roots. I mean, I was like
They're not that far off.
Say again.
Comedy and horror are not that far off from me.
No, they're not. I mean, it's like that was like I was the last short I did, I got the most anxiety because I was like, nobody is going to get that this is supposed to be funny. And
It was
people
hilarious.
did, and I was happy.
Your film was hilarious.
I mean, it was like, so I think that, I think it just depends on the person. We just probably have a lot of people with morbid, dark minds in this group. But I think comedy, writing horror, writing action, I don't think any one of them's easier to do well than the other. However, an individual may just be better at. Some people are just naturally funny. Some people just naturally understand how to ratchet up tension in their prose. I mean, I don't think it's I don't think there's any way you could go to Hollywood and say, hey, I'm going to take the easy way and I'm going to be a horror writer, or I'm going to take the easy way and be a comedy writer. It's you can do any one of those things poorly and maybe find success or failure equally. But doing either one of those things really well, I'm thinking it's probably just as difficult,
I mainly comedies.
You do?
It's more
Yes.
it's more enjoyable. Like I feel so much better when I'm writing comedy than when I write anything like sci-fi or thriller, especially if it's like if one of my characters in a thriller is just a rotten person, because you have to be that rotten person and you just feel like a shitty person at the end of the day. But when you're writing a comedy, it's like you are laughing as you're writing it. It's just such an enjoyable experience.
Try acting, man. One time I was like a slave driver, like this black play, and like the audience booed me when I took my bow. It was terrible.
Good job.
Yeah, it sucks. Like,
I mean, clearly you did well.
The thing is, I think the biggest thing.
Or you had a good audience, because if they would have, I love the slave driver.
Yeah,
the slave driver of my dreams.
Like, thank you.
Successfully made them hate you.
Yeah, I've never been booed. I don't know. I think at least with acting more so, they say like comedy actors can do drama, but drama actors can't necessarily do comedy, because comedy is kind of harder. Because there's just nowhere to hide.
Most stuff that you've done has been comedies, Justin. So do you find them easier?
I don't know. That is my tilt, to Ken's point. It's almost a discipline for me not to put in jokes. Like I just can't help it. I'm like, it'd be hilarious. Like every time I read, to Levi's point, I read history and he thinks things are fucked up, and like I just think they're hilarious. Like there's this whole history of, like, I was reading this book called 1493, and there's basically this one dude who, like, they tried to go from Mexico, I think, where were they going? They were going from the Spanish Empire. They were trying to get up, I forgot where, but they wanted to go back to Portugal, right? They were Portuguese, and they ended up in Virginia. So it didn't go as planned. And then they like walked through the wilderness of Northeast America, or like Chesapeake America, down to literally fucking Texas. And then they were like covered in feathers because they had lost their clothes. They're malnourished. They're like bearded, unkempt. And like the natives, this is back in maybe the 15th century, 16th century, somewhere around there. The natives all thought they were shaman and started like worshiping them as healers, and apparently they performed miracles. And then one of them was black, he was a slave, and so he went back to Mexico City and he was like, hey, I'm a shaman now. And all the Spanish were like, yeah, cool story, so we own you again, go back up to Texas because like you're a slave. And then he went back up and all the natives were like, hey, it's our god. And he was just like, all right, bye guys. And his prince who owned him was like, wait, I own you. He's like, nah man, I'm super into this booze and like infinite amounts of indigenous pussy right now, so I don't think this slavery thing's working out for me. And he just like walked away until they killed him, when the natives like tried to bathe in his blood because they thought it had healing properties. And to me, that whole thing is hilarious. Like
that is really funny.
The whole idea, like, it's tragic because they like cut off his legs and these people are shipwrecked because they're trying to, first of all, you're trying to go to Portugal and you end up in fucking Virginia, which is not Portugal. Second of all, people are worshiping you as a god because you're starving and covered in feathers. And then go from god to slave back to god because of literally booze and women. I'm like, that is amazing. That whole story is just great. And like, I can't look at that and not think it's funny.
You're a really funny guy, so it
Yeah,
makes
it's pretty
sense
fun.
that you would do.
It's pretty funny. I just like the idea of just like all these women running up on him and just being like, "I own you." He's like, "Nah, dude. Like that ain't it for me."
Yeah, I think I'm funny, but the problem is that I don't think other people think I'm funny. So it's more so that my sense of humor, I try to inject it into every work that I do, because I like to laugh. I like to look at a situation and be like, okay. And the thing is that so much of my sense of humor is either it falls into three categories, and sometimes all at once. It is either dark, deadpan, or absurdist. It is either this situation is really, really stupid, and we are taking it to the stupidest possible place that it can go. This is a situation that you usually wouldn't laugh, but I'm going to tilt it just slightly so you're laughing at least uncomfortably. Or I'm going to say something stupid with a straight face and pretend like it never happened. And the thing is that I don't usually write comedies because I do not honestly know if I can make people laugh at the things that I laugh at.
So, sorry.
So Justin, you're sick, so you could really be a good comedy writer.
Yeah, I just for the record,
You're a sick dude.
I know. I have
You know what? You could probably write really good comedy.
my first
just
film was
joking with
someone
you,
having a panic attack over a bowl of oatmeal.
Oh yeah,
That was
that was the
The
best
whole
one.
thing. And then my second film was about sacrificing a call agent because they didn't have a high enough resolution rate to a dark god. Like, yeah. The other thing about comedy, and if for anyone who's listening who wants to write comedy, not everyone's going to think you're funny. Like, humor is too personal, it's too subjective, it's too spectral. If you're the like really the most popular comedian on earth, let's say you're like maybe Kevin Hart or John Mulaney right now, I guess those maybe, I don't know, could someone else throw out a name, but those would be the two, I guess.
Oh.
Bill Burr is pretty big. I guess Russell Peters has always been big. Anyway, like maybe they get 80% of people. Maybe. And like John Mulaney wrote at SNL for 5 years. You know, he was like one of their most successful writers. He sold out Radio City Music Hall for a week. And that's still like 1 out of 5 people are not going to find him funny.
Didn't he have a show that like completely bombed because nobody got the jokes? I think he had a television show and like nobody. I watched it. I didn't laugh once. So there you go.
Jokes don't age well either. Like comedy does not age well.
No.
Most comedies, they last for like maybe 5 years or so. I mean, seriously, watch a standard comedy in 2010. I mean, you might even be horrified because of like, wow, they really said those things and they did those things like, you know. But
I always laugh at Frasier.
There are a couple that stand the test of time.
Makes me laugh. Isn't that weird?
But Frasier's really character driven. That's a good example.
That's
It's a great example.
Character will carry. Like Cheers, I think ages better than Friends because I think the characters are a little bit.
Cheers and Taxi. They're from the 70s and they're still funny today.
Seinfeld, the characters are more absurd, but they're still like consistent characters to me.
Cosby didn't age well.
It is.
No, not at all.
Really,
Not at all.
But that comedy, that's pop level comedy. It's for the masses. You know, Taxi and Cheers they had massive appeal, but the way they were written, they kind of had to grow that massive appeal, like a Seinfeld.
Yeah, because Frasier and Taxi, those shows are all character driven, and the comedy comes from the fact that the characters are so inept in so many ways, and yet Frasier is brilliant. The two guys were totally brilliant, and it was so well written. That was big.
I do want to say one more thing on the comedy versus horror, which is more difficult. I will say, after I have to retract a part of my previous statement in that comedy is really a crueler master than horror in other genres, in that people are very I mean, you show someone a bad horror short, they'll go, man. You show someone a comedy short and they don't laugh, they get angry. I think it's just
They'll lose some skin.
yeah. It's just you gotta have some thick skin to do comedy, because you will get. I have literally put stuff. I've won a comedy contest. That was the first contest I won, was a comedy contest. Flew me out to LA. Fantastic. Somebody read it, said, "Hey, it's the best thing I've ever read." Somebody else read it and they insulted me as a human being because they said I was juvenile. They literally, I mean, I'm talking about in the if you guys have ever had coverage before, they showed me the coverage. And one of the coverages I got back, where a reader read review, they said that I should go out on a date because I've never been with a woman, and I'm like, what? I mean, I get that.
And you know what, Ken? They probably stole that from you, the guy that ripped you apart.
Yeah,
probably. But
I'll say, yeah, to, I guess, picking back on that, two stories. One, there was this guy who in the Nichols, he submitted to the Nichols Fellowship, which is like the biggest screenwriting fellowship if anyone's considering doing it. Didn't get past the first round 1 year. Next year sent the same exact script and won it. Like won. I submitted to the Maryland Film Festival and I got like okay marks, but my weakest mark was dialogue, and I just didn't take it. I just I just thought the reader didn't get it. I sent it to another screenwriter I know who works on Sabrina for Netflix, and he was like, "Don't take that." He's like, "You could polish up your dialogue, like don't." He gave me the lowest mark possible in dialogue, and the guy his name is Josh Conkle, who he works for Netflix, and we met through like a theater company a while ago. He's a nice guy, but he like I wrote it. I was like, I'm like, hey, this was like kind of tough blow. Am I crazy? And he was like, I think you're right. I think they didn't get it. Like, they just read so many scripts. Like when you do that, I was a festival coordinator too. When you do that, like you're trying to find the thing that's wrong with the script, because that's your job. That's literally your job on those festivals. So
and your night's over when you can say I don't like it. Whereas if you like something, it takes more work to like something to dislike it. So
well,
yeah.
and
the best way around all that is join the Charm City Film Group, learn how to make films and learn how to write those films. Well, learn how to write and then learn how to film or concurrently, and then like be really good at that, because that's the most empowering thing, because that makes you into a film entrepreneur at that point. If you know how to make a short, then you know how to make a bigger short. And if you know how to make a bigger short, then you know how to actually make a cheap feature. And then at that point, it's just a matter of figuring out how to sell it properly so that you can get independent funding to make it, which is an extremely hard thing to do. But I strongly encourage everybody to do that, because otherwise you're always going to be at the mercy of this person or that person. I mean, everybody's always going to be at the mercy of money, but in terms of like if you're a writer and you want to go to Hollywood or whatever and say you're really good, sure, you may have an amazing spec script, but at the end of the day, they're going to say, wow, we love your writing, but we have this other story that we want you to work on, and it may be cool and everything like that, but like you're always going to basically be a contractor working on existing IP that seems more valuable to production companies. But if you want to make your spec script and you really want to get your thing out, and you want true agency and independency, then going that route, like it's a harder route to go, but it's way more rewarding because you get to actually do the thing that you really want to do.
Does anyone else have any questions? Let me ask you this. Oh, go ahead.
Just a comment about comedy. Until our next film comes out, you maybe see what we're talking about is based on experience or an exaggeration of experience. A couple of my heroes, and I don't think everybody will agree with it, but are Woody Allen and Larry David. They're types of comedy. It's sort of an amalgamation of it. But these are the things that I find amusing and that I'm writing about or hope to are based on real life situations and an exaggeration of what really occurs. And for me, that satisfies my experience in writing. Yeah, I've got a long way to go yet, but that's, comedy is really an exaggeration or something of the unexpected.
Yeah, it depends on the comedy. There's a lot of comedies. I mean, we kind of think of comedy as one genre, and it's not. Like my sense of humor is the opposite. Like I'm like the most ridiculous. Like I just want to go as far out there from my ordinary life as possible. Which, yeah, I mean, like that's probably you just might not like it, which is fine. You can't please everybody with comedy. That's why it's kind of like a mid-market. That's why it works better in TV. It's more about having the people who like it be loyal than it is to try to get everybody.
I know that, if I go to theater and if there's a comedy in theater, that has to really be good because the audience is right there. And most times the comedies I have seen in theater have been wonderful, just wonderful. And you're right, there are different types of comedy. Like Lucille Ball, I think that series was hysterical. And it's more like slapstick, type of comedy. And to me, she was hysterical. So it's true. I think comedy is really hard. They have a lot of romantic comedies now on Netflix, and I don't find them funny. I really don't. And they call it romantic comedies, But I was just saying this about comedy because so much, I feel that it's easier for people to write more dramatic stuff, tragedies, the horror, all that stuff than it is to write comedy, because I think comedy is probably one of the hardest things to write.
Well, the thing is that at least the way I see it, if I'm watching a bad horror flick or a bad drama or something else, look, if the film doesn't scare me, I can find some fun somewhere else, or I can find positives. Hey, it's well shot, it's well performed, the soundtrack's cool, or whatever else. The fact of the matter is, if I'm watching a bad comedy, there's only so many times I can say that's not funny until I just turn it off. Because the thing is that, okay, think to yourself how many times you've ever read a review or heard someone talking about a comedy and they're like, but I really liked the camera work, it wasn't funny. It's like, the fact is, nobody, at least not usually. There are not a lot of times that people are going to talk about any of the other aspects of comedy and what they did well. If it doesn't make you laugh, people are just going to shut it off.
Well,
and I think that's what makes it so difficult sometimes, because it's often like that. I think people are just afraid, like, that's what you're leaning on. If the writing just isn't there, if the performances just aren't there, you're dead in the water.
Comedy also has cultural limitations too.
yeah.
I mean, some comedies just don't translate to, other countries, cultures, languages. I mean,
Even across the country, sometimes it's
there's regional. Larry the Cable Guy is not going to go as well in Harlem as, and I'm pretty sure some of the Tyler Perry films won't go as well in the middle of Oklahoma somewhere. So
that kind of gets just be racist, dude, and that's really big in the middle of Oklahoma. Just be like, I knew I didn't like them. Like, I will say the one thing, we were talking to Levi's point, I do think a lot of comedy directors don't use the other elements of cinema as much as they rely on verbalization.
Yeah.
And like people overlean on language for comedy versus someone like Edgar Wright, or let's say Billy Wilder.
Yeah.
If you want to go back, or
That's
Buster
true.
Keaton. If you want to go all the way back, Buster Keaton, right? Like his stuff was really thought out. Like all his jokes were very visual.
Well, they had to be.
Yeah, they were
Not
sound.
like they had sound.
Yeah.
Guys like both Keaton and someone like Charlie Chaplin, where it was built purely on visual. It was built on the situations. it was one of the reasons why they had such mass appeal, because Charlie Chaplin spoke French and he spoke German and he spoke Chinese and Japanese and he spoke every language because he didn't need to speak.
Hey, if I worked in silent film, it'd be pretty easy for me to claim that too.
I will say, if you're going to write a film, if you're going to write a comedy, that's a good way to start. Like, don't write the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so easy to fall in love with. Like, think about your camera work, think about your blocking.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, sort of turn the question around, Roz. Are you more like asking, how do I write a comedy, or why isn't there more comedies by Charm City?
I think your second thing, why aren't there more comedies? You know, I guess because of what's going on in the world right now, I'd like to laugh rather than get scared or get depressed. You know, I think the things people write are wonderful. It's just that me personally, I would like to laugh, because laughing to me is a very therapeutic, healing thing, so I just prefer that. I do want to say to all of you, though, before we get off, that you've been so informative, and I thank you all for all your input, because especially when you talked about what inspires you, what gives you an idea, and how you start a story, because those are areas that would be more difficult for me, so I just wanted to thank you all. I thought this panel thing really works wonderfully. Really, it's good.
I echo that too.
Well, I'm glad I actually make some semblance of sense, because I'm just like, well, hopefully someone absorbs any of this, and all of these people who have been writing way longer than me aren't like, what is this kid talking about? What's he going on about? He's giving bad advice.
No, I'll tell you, Levi, from the first time we met you, you were an actor. So I think you've really developed yourself to become a writer as well. That's pretty fantastic. You've done some very good work.
I do think that seeing writing, I think the broad answer to a lot of these questions is that it's very personal. The reason I wanted to do a writer's panel is because I think there's a lot of different perspectives on what makes good comedy, what makes a good short, how do you develop characters. And I certainly hope that was what everyone got from this. Does anyone else have any questions at this point? Okay. Let me first start by thanking all of these super awesome writers who were very, very kind and generous with their time and advice and insight. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Diety in absentia. And then beyond that, let me thank the audience. I think that's about all we have. So we will wrap up at that point.